Welcome back everybody to the High Bricks cultivation system. Today we're going to be talking about how to jumpstart your living soil or to mix a soil from scratch. So more specifically, we'll be going over the pros and cons of using pots versus raised beds versus growing in the ground with native soil. We'll talk about how much soil you're going to need in order to grow high bricks plants. We will talk about how to jumpstart a native soil if that's what you're working with. And then we'll also talk about a custom soil mix specifically for growing high bricks plants. So you're starting your garden or your grow or your farm. How do you decide which method is the best to grow with? Pots, raised beds, growing in the ground. There are a lot of things to consider when choosing one of these methods. And it's something that should be considered carefully. A lot of people don't really think about it before just jumping into one particular way of growing, but there are some important considerations for each of these. So first, let's talk about growing in pots. Perhaps the biggest advantage of growing in pots is that you can fit your growing into a small space, and it's really the most flexible option in terms of where you can grow and whether or not you're going to need to move your plants in the middle of growing. Pots give you that flexibility to move plants if you need to fit them into maybe smaller spaces, maybe irregularly shaped spaces. Even if you're growing in an apartment, maybe you have just have a balcony to grow on, pots can be a very good option for something like that. Or maybe you need to move your pots at some point after one grow cycle. Maybe you anticipate moving shortly and you want to keep and preserve your living soil that you've worked so hard on. Pots, again, are a really good option for that. Another advantage of growing in pots is that you can choose what to put into your soil. This is also an advantage we'll see of raised beds, but you can mix a custom soil mix, make it very rich, very good for growing high bricks plants. And growing in pots is perhaps the easiest way to prevent animal pests from getting into your grow. Not only do pots give you a physical barrier to pests, but you also can put them in places where animal pests are less likely to be a problem. Now, some of the downsides of growing in pots is it's typically one of the more expensive options. You have to get the soil mix and you have to get the pots themselves, which are typically something that have to be purchased. You can't necessarily build them yourself. And unlike raised beds, you have more surface area, which means higher cost, and it also means that there's more opportunities for water loss and evaporation because of that larger surface area around your pots. And this can lead to what's called the crowning effect, where you in fact have smaller, if you're growing along the edges of your pots, you're going to get smaller plants there because they are losing some moisture out the side of the pots. Also, another disadvantage of growing in pots is that each of your plants is going to be isolated from each other. And there's actually some advantages to having the pots all in the same soil because, believe it or not, the plants can communicate with each other and even warn each other of pests and disease invasions, and therefore be more prepared for if that comes. If a pest starts attacking one plant, the other plants can be more prepared. Now on to raised bed growth. Just like pots, one of the big advantages of growing in raised beds is, again, you can have a very custom soil mix and mix that soil yourself and put very custom ingredients into it. It also is easier to protect from animal pests. Again, you can have a physical barrier that will keep those pests out. And unlike pots, it allows your plants to be growing in the same soil bed, and so therefore they can network with each other or communicate with each other. And you get an increased benefit from that. Now, some of the disadvantages of raised beds is that they're a little bit more permanent than pots, so they're going to be a lot harder to move around. Not technically impossible, but still a lot harder and a lot harder to preserve that soil that way. You're also, just like with pots, going to run into that crowning effect where you can lose moisture to those outer edges. and they're still relatively expensive compared to growing in native soil. Now, some variations on raised beds that can solve the issue of the crowning effect. With wooden beds, which are the most common, that's where you're going to lose a lot of the moisture, but some people make beds, for instance, out of metal, which is going to keep the moisture in better. It's going to create more of a barrier there. Another option that I recently did was actually kind of a hybrid of growing in ground and growing in a bed, where I actually dug out a pit in the ground, put in a barrier to prevent gophers, to prevent pests from getting in, and then put my custom soil mix into that. So this way I don't lose the moisture from the crowning effect, I still have that physical barrier to prevent the animal pests, but I can still use my custom soil blend. Here's another kind of raised bed that is becoming popular among living soil growers, the fabric raised bed, the most popular version of which is made by a company called Grassroots. They make Grassroots fabric pots, Grassroots fabric beds. They make special fabrics that help hold the moisture in, and that makes them really good for living soil. They also are a little bit more mobile. So in this version you can see that they're resting on a pallet, which makes it so that if you need to move them, you could, although you probably need a forklift to do so because that soil is going to be pretty heavy, but it does make them somewhat mobile. And finally, addressing growing in ground or in native soil, this is probably going to be the lowest cost solution because you've got that soil there. You don't need to buy a soil mix, and you've got the soil. It's free, at least if you own the land. It's also the most natural way to grow, which means because our goal here really is to mimic nature and create a natural ecosystem, having that native soil is going to make it a little bit easier to do this. As we talked about a while back, native soils have different soil horizons. So they start with the organic layer on top, and as you go down further in the soil, you start running into different mineral layers, sands and clays and silts. Now that sand and clay and silt is something that you don't really get in a soil mix, and there are some advantages to that in terms of holding nutrients and holding water, and actually allowing water to travel up and down in the soil horizons. So there are some advantages to natural soil if you can figure out how to work with it. And of course, growing in native soil allows the plants to network with each other, allows them to communicate. They're all in the same bed of soil. Now, some of the disadvantages, really only two major disadvantages of growing in native soil. Really, again, because this is the most natural way of growing, we do encourage this, but we realize a lot of people are not going to be able to grow in native soil for whatever reason. But really, two of the biggest disadvantages are that you have to work with what you have. So maybe you don't have the most ideal soil conditions, and you have to figure out how to improve that soil so that it's better for growing. And it's also the most difficult to control animal pests. So if you're growing, especially in a more natural environment, maybe out in the forest, out in a more wild area, you're going to have to deal with some animal pests. Where I live, gophers are the most common one, and they can wreak havoc on a garden. So you can set gopher traps, but they're not always the most effective, so you're going to have to find ways to deal with that. And along those lines, just want to bring up, again, this movie, The Biggest Little Farm. It really gives a great illustration of how you can work with nature to bring balance to your farm and to deal with those different animal pests. The couple in this movie has to deal with gopher problems, they have to deal with foxes, and they find ways to deal with that by introducing other animals and other predators into the ecosystem. Alright, so how much soil do you need per plant? Well, if you're going to be mixing a soil, we typically recommend about 10 gallons per foot of plant height. So if you expect the plant to get 2 feet tall, you're going to want 20 gallons. Now, really, for growing cannabis at least, 20 gallons is the minimum that we recommend. Now that might sound like a lot. If you've grown cannabis with hydroponic methods or other methods, you may be used to just 5-gallon pots of soil. So you may wonder, well, why do I need 20 gallons? I mean, that's going to be 4 times as expensive to get that much soil. Well, remember, this is a different kind of growing, and that we are going to be reusing the soil grow cycle after grow cycle, season after season. Some of the best living soil growers are able to get dozens of cycles out of their soil, and they continue to improve on it year after year. Joshua Steensland is in his 10th cycle with his soil right now. Green Life Productions out of Vegas has been growing the same soil for, I believe, 22 or greater grow cycles. So even though it's a bigger cost up front and you're putting in more soil per plant, in the long run it's actually going to be less expensive, and you're working on building the soil. So your plants, in order to get high bricks, they need to have more space. They need space to stretch out. They need space to go and find those nutrients in the soil. So don't be scared away by the larger amount of soil that it may take up front. Again, remember, it's a little bit of an investment, but it's going to pay so many dividends going forward. Now, along a similar line, if you do decide to grow in ground in native soil, you might wonder, well, how much space do you need between your plants? Well, for different plants, there's different spacing recommendations, and you can usually find this either on the seed bag or just by looking it up on the internet. For cannabis specifically, we recommend allowing about 1.3 cubic feet of soil area per foot of plant height. So that's how tall you expect the plants to be. So if you expect them only to be a foot tall, then you just need about 1.3 cubic feet of area. If you're expecting them to be 10 feet tall, then you're going to want to leave a lot more space for those plants. Alright, so what do you do if you're working with native soil and you're trying to start a high-bricks garden or high-bricks farm, and you really want to make sure that your plants are going to have really great soil, but you have to kind of work with what you have. So how can you jumpstart this in order to get those microbes going and turn the soil into really rich soil? This is part of what regenerative agriculture is all about, is using these techniques to improve soil over time and to make native soil into something that is really valuable. So here's just kind of a general prescription for how you can improve native soil. Now, this may change a little bit depending on exactly the situation you're dealing with. There are many different types of soil, but as a general rule, this is something that we know generally is going to work to improve and to jumpstart that soil. So it starts with knowing your soil type, and this is especially important to know if you have a more clay soil or a more sandy soil. Those are the two extremes in terms of the types of soil. They're defined by particle size, so clay has really small particles, sand has much larger particles. So with sandy soil, you're going to have water retention issues. Water is easily going to leach out of that soil with the larger particles, whereas with clay, you're going to hold water pretty easily, but you're going to have more issues with soil compaction and with drainage, lack of drainage. And also clay soil, because of its electrical properties, it tends to bind nutrients more easily, whereas sand is not going to hold those nutrients as well. And that can be a good and a bad thing. Now, there's going to be lots of in-betweens, but generally we're going to be working with a clay-dominant soil or a sand-dominant soil, and there's somewhat different prescriptions for those two. So if you're working with more clay soil or a soil that has just been so degraded to the point where it's heavily compacted, what do? How do you get things to start growing in that? Well, first step is probably going to be some sort of mechanical aeration or mechanical loosening of the soil. So this may mean tilling the soil initially. In fact, it's probably a good idea if you're working with compacted soil to initially do one till of the soil. After that, we want to try and become no-till, but you're going to have to loosen that soil up somehow, and a mechanical means seems to be one of the easiest ways to do that. Now, if you just mechanically loosen the soil and you don't do anything else, you're going to very quickly go back to that compaction problem. So on top of that, you're going to want to potentially use some sort of biostimulant. Microbial products like Bioflux will actually help to loosen compacted soils. Another thing you can do once you've loosened that soil is to immediately plant a cover crop. So get some roots into that soil, because roots are going to create pathways, they're going to stimulate microbial growth, and they're going to start to break up and loosen that soil and give it better structure. Now, on the other hand, if you're working with a sandy soil that's going to have a hard time retaining water and nutrients, you're probably going to want to amend that heavily with organic material, because organic material is going to help you hold on to that water and nutrients. So, two types of organic material that are really useful for this situation: compost and or biochar. Now, you want to be careful not to amend too much biochar. You don't want to put in more than 10% of the volume of soil you're working with. So you're going to want to calculate the depth of your soil, maybe down to 6 inches or 12 inches, probably the depth that you're actually tilling it, and then calculate how much biochar you need to mix in to get somewhere between 5 to 10%. And that will improve the soil dramatically if you can get 5 to 10% biochar in there. With compost, you're going to need a much larger volume of it, but it is a little bit less expensive than biochar too, so those two probably balance each other out. And both of them are going to add great organic matter and potential to hold organic nutrients and microbial life. Now, once you've amended that soil, just like with the compacted soil, immediately putting in a cover crop is a great idea. Cover crop is, again, going to build soil structure. It's going to put nutrients in there. It's going to stimulate microbial activity. Cover crop is always a good idea for jump-starting a soil that needs to be revived. And then a great thing you can do once you've planted a cover crop, rather than just cutting the cover crop down, probably one of the best things you can do is to bring some animals in, ruminants like goats or sheep or cows, to graze that cover crop. Because what they're going to do is they're going to turn that cover crop into a manure. They're going to poop it out all over the ground, and manure is a really great amendment for jump-starting a soil. Your soil will come back to life so quickly with the right amount of manure. Now, this doesn't mean you have to go out and buy animals yourself. You can usually rent some animals, or even sometimes get paid by people to bring their animals in and graze your area. And even if you have a small market garden, maybe just a quarter of an acre, you still may be able to find a goat or a sheep herd that's small enough to come in and graze that cover crop. So all of this may require a season or two, maybe even a full year to get things going, but it's really going to be worth it. So if you can be patient to get that land ready before you plant your first crop, you're going to have such an easier time going forward, and you're going to be growing much better quality, much higher quality Hybrix plants right off the bat if you can do these things to jumpstart your soil first. All right, and finally, we're going to talk about how to mix a living soil from scratch. If you're working with pots or raised beds, or you want to do like I did and dig out a bed in the ground, this is a really high quality soil mix to use that once you've mixed it and you put it in there, it's going to last you for season after season after season, and you can really get a lot out of this. So because we are discouraging fertilization, you really don't want to be dependent on fertilization, we want to make sure that our soil mix gets all of the nutrients the plants need into it from the beginning. And there's a common misconception I want to clear up here. A lot of people think that when you've used soil after a couple cycles and it's becoming less productive, that means that the nutrients have run out of that soil. In fact, that's very rarely the case. It takes actually quite a long time for all of the good nutrients in that soil to actually be exhausted, especially if you re-amend with organic material and compost. What's usually happening is that fertilizers are being overused and they're killing off the microbial life, and therefore making the nutrients not bioavailable to the plant. So we'll see that even with just a small amount of nutrients, this soil mix can last us many, many grow cycles. So what's in the soil mix? Well, this is the overview of the recipe here, and then we're going to go into each of these ingredients in a little bit more detail. So I want to give credit to this soil mix. The base of it originally comes from Clackamas Coots, who is well known on grow forums on the internet for coming up with this living soil mix. A lot of people use this. It's recommended by Build a Soil and a lot of other groups. And we've tweaked it a little bit based on our research and recommendations, but the base of this comes from Coots. So we're going to start with 33% peat substitute. So this is a substitute for peat moss. Peat moss is a very common organic material that is used to give structure to soil mixes. The problem with peat moss is that even if the producers of it claim that it's sustainably harvested, you really can't sustainably harvest peat. Every time that you mine peat, you're destroying an ecosystem, pretty much no matter what. So we really discourage using peat moss, and especially because there are some great substitutes out there now. So if you're on the East Coast, a great substitute is a company called Pit Moss out of Pittsburgh, makes a peat moss substitute from recycled paper. If you're on the West Coast and shipping is a little more expensive, there's another great option out here called AgriPeat. It comes from a company called AgriLife, and they actually make this peat from cow manure fibers. They take the fibrous material out of cow manure, strain out all the liquid, and they make this into a peat-like material. And I've used both of these materials in my growing, and they work great. They're really just as well, if not better, than regular peat moss. Now the next piece is your aeration material. Now the hope is that over time, your soil is going to become aerated by having good structure and by all the little critters that we're going to introduce, like worms. But initially, because we're dealing with a lot of organic material here and we don't want it to become too compact, we're going to introduce something for physical aeration. The next piece is worm castings. Worm castings are just an all-around great fertility and organic matter source for plants. You can't really overdo it with worm castings. You can never burn your plant with worm castings. And then equal part of compost. You want to make sure this is mature compost and ideally local compost. And then finally, the last major piece is going to be inoculated biochar. And then we're also going to add some trace elements in here, which we'll also talk about in more detail. So once again, just covering the peat substitute, the two options that I mentioned, pit moss and AgriPeat. There may very well be other ones out there, but these are two of the best options that I know of based on the West Coast and on the East Coast. So we highly recommend checking out one of these. You can see in that picture on the left there in the yellow bag, that's the pit moss, and in the wheelbarrow, that's the AgriPeat. Now for aeration, we recommend using something called pumice rock, which is a volcanic rock. That's one good option. You can also use rice hulls, and you can even use wood chips. Now with rice hulls and with wood chips, these are very hard, woody materials, but they are organic materials. So over a long period of time, they will eventually decompose and break down in your soil. And the advantage of that is they're eventually going to add actually more nutrients and in fact probably help promote fungal growth in your soil. And by the time they've broken down, you probably won't really need them as aeration anymore, because again, things like worms and plant roots are going to create that aeration for you over time. Pumice rock is a more permanent aeration solution, and if you want something more permanent, we recommend that over perlite, which is also a common aeration. Perlite is an artificial material that's made from essentially taking glass and popping it like popcorn. It's a little bit more abrasive. It's not so great for microlife like worms. So we recommend pumice if you want something like perlite that's going to be more permanent. But really, with this living soil recipe and the methods that we're using, something like rice hulls or wood chips are going to work fine. Now with your worm castings, it's definitely recommended to get these from a local source if you can. But if you're going to buy some sort of branded worm castings in a bag, make sure, number one, that they are pure worm castings, that they're not mixed with anything else as filler. Make sure that they're organic, just because organic will guarantee a certain level of quality. And if you can, get something that's certified organic by the CDFA. OMRI is a very well-known organic certification, but in our experience, OMRI doesn't have quite as high of standards as CDFA, the California Department of Food and Agriculture. So if you can get that CDFA seal, that's really the best. And then make sure whatever worm castings you get are moist. So some companies will dry out their worm castings in order to decrease the weight and cut down transportation costs. But when you do this, you lose a lot of the benefits of those worm castings, and honestly, they're just not going to be as high quality anymore. So if you are going to buy bagged worm castings, make sure that they are moist. These two brands here, I know because I've used them, that they are really high quality and they come wet. So Wonderworm and Heritage Organics Earthworms castings are two great brands. I'm sure there's other ones out there. And otherwise, try to get local worm castings. There's lots of small businesses all over the country where people are producing their own worm castings. Just make sure that they're finished worm castings, that they don't have contaminants in them. Like in this picture you can see here, there's a seed sprouting and there's a piece of blueberry that's not fully decomposed and some sort of fruit peel. So make sure that they are finished worm castings, because you don't want to get other seeds in there that might sprout and grow something that's going to compete with your plants. But worm castings with organic material that's not fully 100% broken down, not the end of the world. That material will break down eventually, especially if you have worms in your soil. Now for the compost. We say mature compost because if you're making your own compost, or you're using a local compost, or some compost made by your friend or your neighbor, making sure that it's mature and that it's finished is the most important thing. Because immature compost will actually steal nitrogen from your plants because it's still trying to break down, and compost needs to consume nitrogen in the process of breaking down organic material. So there's a few ways you can test this. One of the most reliable is to put the compost in a sealed plastic bag for a few days, for about 3 days, and then open it back up. And if it still smells like earth or like forest floor, then that means it's mature finished compost. But if it has a rancid smell to it, that means that it's not fully finished composting. Now, if you're going to buy a commercial compost, things to consider are certainly the source material that was made from. There now, with organic recycling programs becoming more popular across the country, there are a lot of composts that are made from food scraps from homes and restaurants. And even though we really love the fact that more organics are being recycled, and we really encourage this, you have to be careful about the content of those things, because they can be a little bit more contaminated. And so if you're buying a commercial compost, get it tested first. Get it tested for heavy metals, get it tested for sodium, to get it tested for other potential contaminants. Or ask the compost company what the materials are, and if it's not coming from some sort of municipal collection program, then it's probably a slightly higher end compost. But ultimately, your compost, it should smell like earth. It should kind of smell like a forest floor. If it has any other smell, that means there's probably something wrong with it. And then it's important to note whether or not there is biochar in your compost. It's becoming more popular to sometimes mix biochar into compost in the process of making it, because the two of them do go well together. But because our next ingredient is biochar, you want to make sure that you're not accidentally overdoing it on the biochar with biochar in your compost and adding it additionally, because too much biochar can actually lock out your plant's nutrients. All right, and then our last piece. Now we say inoculated biochar because just raw biochar can potentially have some disadvantages for your soil. If the biochar is bone dry and doesn't have anything inoculated in it, it can actually steal moisture and steal nutrients from your plants initially, because biochar acts kind of like a sponge. It wants to soak these things up. So by inoculating it beforehand, we are filling that sponge and making sure that it's not robbing from the plant, but in fact releasing to the plant when it's needed. So there are different ways to inoculate biochar. Really, you're just trying to get some kind of moisture, biology, nutrients into it. At Everflux, we make TerraFlux, which is an inoculated biochar. It's inoculated with Bioflux, which actually has an additional benefit of balancing the pH of biochar. Biochar is typically naturally has a pretty high pH, somewhere in the range of 9 to 11, so it's very alkaline. Bioflux is an acidic material, so the two of them together bring the pH back closer to neutral, which is a nice extra benefit. But if you are going to source another type of biochar, make sure that it has a very high carbon percentage and a low ash percentage. The main advantage of biochar is the carbon content. If you have too much ash in your biochar, that ash consists of mineral nutrients, which could be good for the plant, but if you have too much of that, you can potentially create an imbalance. For example, a calcium-magnesium imbalance or a calcium-potassium imbalance. So you don't want to introduce a wild card like that. What you want biochar for is for the carbon. So a percentage of 90% or greater for the carbon signals a good high-quality biochar. And you should ask the manufacturer if they have some sort of certificate of analysis that shows this. And finally, don't mistake biochar for activated carbon. Those are actually two different things, although they may look and sound the same. Activated carbon is made in a very different way, and it's not what you want. Now, in addition to these larger ingredients by percentage, we're also going to add some trace amounts of these various minerals and elements that are going to increase the nutrients in the soil and also just act as a catalyst for getting the soil going. So for every 15 gallons of soil, we're going to add 1 cup of kelp meal. Kelp meal is great microbe food. It also does contain some nutrients for the plant. Crab meal has a lot more nutrients for the plant, and it also contains something called chitin, which is a great material to help the plant protect itself from disease and parasitic organisms. And then gypsum or oyster shell is largely added as a source of calcium. What we find is that even though N, P, and K are looked at as the macronutrients, calcium can often be a major limiting nutrient in plant growth and something that is not as available in the soil, so we're going to add some extra calcium. And then we're going to add 2 cups per 15 gallons of basalt or azomite. Either of these minerals will work to add trace elements, trace minerals to the soil, like iron, sulfur, copper, other minerals that we need in small amounts. And then finally, we're going to add a little bit of composted chicken manure. Now, you could substitute this for a number of different organic amendments or other manures. Even something like alfalfa meal will work well. You really just want something that is relatively balanced in organic nutrients, and composted chicken manure just happens to be a great one that is relatively inexpensive. There's a brand called Stutzman's Farms out of Oregon that makes really great composted chicken manure, and I'm sure you can find other ones. You can find it locally. Make sure it's composted though, because we don't want it to be so high in available nutrients that it could burn plants. So by incorporating these things in just small amounts into the soil initially, we're really going to give the plants everything that they need for many, many generations. Now, when you're choosing your container, either a pot or a raised bed, Grassroots makes these great, as we talked about already, fabric pots and fabric raised beds. So after you've mixed all of the soil, you can put it into one of these containers. And then from there, you're going to add things like earthworms, rove beetles, and springtail mites to get your ecosystem going. Earthworms are really the #1 recommendation. They have so many benefits for the soil. This will really help you to mimic a natural system. Now, if you're growing outside, you are probably naturally going to get other decomposing organisms like roly-polies or potentially rove beetles or springtail mites just finding their way into your soil naturally. But if you're growing indoors, it can be especially good to introduce some of these organisms. They will help with decomposition, and they also act as predators. They will eat pests that might come along too. So remember, we're trying to create a balanced ecosystem here. Decomposition is important because that's what makes the nutrients bioavailable to the plant, and we are going to elaborate more on these in a later lesson. The next thing you'll want to do is add a cover crop to your soil. We will also talk more about cover crops and why they're important in a later lesson, but just very basic right now. You're going to want to apply about a tablespoon per square foot of soil of a cover crop blend. Preferably the more species the better. You always want more biodiversity, as we know. Build a Soil makes a great 12 species cover crop blend of largely clovers, but you can also find other blends out there. And largely you want to look for nitrogen fixers, because this is what we're after. Besides the soil structure and the boost that cover crops can give, we also want something that can bring more nitrogen into the soil. And then finally, once you've added your critters and you've seeded your cover crop, you can cover the soil with a mulch. We recommend rice straw, because even if there's seeds in it, rice straw is not going to germinate. It needs a lot of water in order to germinate. You can use other straws, but there might be a risk if there's seeds mixed in there of that somehow germinating and you start to grow something you don't necessarily want in your soil. But you want a mulch in order to keep the water in, especially if you're working in a hotter or drier climate while the cover crop is still getting ready to grow. Alternatively, you can just be really diligent about watering your cover crop every day, but you will go through a lot of water to keep that soil moist before your cover crop sprouts. And the cover crop will and can sprout underneath a layer of hay. Now, simultaneously, while you're growing your cover crop, this is when I start my seedlings. As I mentioned, I prefer to grow from seed. I think for hybrids growing, there's a lot of advantages to growing from seed. So I will start my seedlings in small paper cups using the exact same soil mix. I usually leave a little bit left over for this purpose. I put the seeds directly into the soil. Some people want to germinate them on paper towels, on plates, but really I think it's best for the seed to start out in the soil environment where it belongs, where it has contact with microbes immediately. It's just going to give it the best head start. So get those seeds started in a paper cup of soil, and after 4 weeks or so, they should have grown to the point where they're starting to outgrow these cups. You should have pretty large, robust seedlings at that point, and that will be about the amount of time that you want your cover crop to grow and to really get your soil going. And once those two are ready, you can transplant. So here's a bed that is growing the cover crop and it's ready for transplanting. And that is basically how you jumpstart your living high brick soil. So that's it. For our next lesson, we will go into more detail on cover crops, and we'll also talk about the benefits of companion planting. So we'll see you next week.